You know, Martin is a company America should be really proud of because they've never compromised. They've never done less than their best. They've continually made the best instruments in the world. And this is the flagship of the fleet, ladies and gentlemen, right here. It's the Dreadnought.
The legend began on a humble wooden workbench in a dusty factory in 1916. The guitar built that summer by C.F. Martin and Company in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, had a startling design. In time, this guitar would become one of the world's most popular instruments and shape the sound of American music.
Martin guitars aren't the fanciest. They certainly aren't the gaudiest guitars ever made. But they serve a purpose. They work. And that's why they appeal to so many guitar players. They know that the Martin guitar is going to be there when they need it. It really is the perfect tool for any singer-songwriter.
Throughout the first half of the 19th century, guitars were small, meant to be cradled in a player's arms and heard in intimate settings like a parlor. By the 1850s, music was changing from a personal pursuit to a professional one. The country teemed with small bands and traveling musicians. They began performing in halls in front of large audiences. At this time, the guitar wasn't the star instrument it would later become, but part of a band's rhythmic backbone. For both soloists and bands, Martin kept making larger-sized guitars so they could be heard in bigger venues.
Well, Martin had been getting demand for bigger guitars right from the 1850s. So up until that point, they were the single-O guitars, and starting around the 1850s, they started making the double-Os. But the demand continued to come for larger guitars, so by 1901, Martin started making the triple-O guitars, and things just continued on from there because of the increase of the guitar and mandolin bands. So slowly but surely there was a demand for the larger guitars, and there was also a demand for louder guitars in Hawaiian music as well. And eventually that led to sort of a connection on the Dreadnought guitars.
The music that came from Hawaiian Islands had a gentle, dreamy sound, made primarily with guitars and ukuleles. At the dawn of the 20th century, this exotic music broke free from Hawaii and began sweeping the mainland. Within 15 years, the Hawaiian music craze would lead to the design of the first Dreadnought guitar. The Oliver Ditson Company was a giant music retailer doing business in the early decades of the 20th century. They wanted a guitar that could be marketed to players in Hawaiian music bands. This guitar needed lots of volume to be heard over the other loud instruments. Ditson found what they were looking for in a guitar Martin made in 1915 for one of Hawaii's most talented players.
Well, there was a very famous Hawaiian band leader called Major Kealakai. He approached Martin in December of 1915 for an extra large guitar. So Martin took their current triple-O and they increased the width by half an inch and the length by half an inch.
This jumbo-sized guitar strongly influenced the shape and size of the first Dreadnought. When Harry Hunt of Ditson saw the model made for Major Kealakai, he wanted to take the design further. So Harry Hunt, Frank Henry Martin, and a young Martin employee named John Dykeman worked together to build the first Dreadnought. It was like the Kealakai guitar in every way, except it had a wider waist, deeper bass, and more volume.
Ditson, Martin's distributor in New York City, commissioned a number of instruments, the larger size being the Dreadnought guitar body shape. This was a big, bassy guitar. In fact, it was called a bass guitar, and the larger body produced a tremendous volume that the Hawaiian players wanted.
Frank Henry Martin named this new guitar the largest one his company had ever built, the Dreadnought.
He said to himself, that's the biggest battleship the world has ever seen, and this is the biggest and best guitar the world has ever seen. I'm going to call it a Dreadnought. The Dreadnought, the battleship, was put in the water in 1906, 10 years before the development of the Martin Dreadnought. And one of the most interesting things I've learned about the Dreadnought, the battleship, the stays that hold the hull together were made by hand, just like the braces of a Martin Dreadnought.
The Dreadnought was Martin's name, but Ditson called it the 111.
The Ditson 111 is already the iconic Dreadnought shape. It is the shape of all Dreadnoughts to come, except in the fact that it's still a 12-fret body. So it's that slope-shouldered, broad-waisted, deep-bodied guitar that eventually became the modern Dreadnought.
Martin manufactured the Dreadnought, but Ditson would market it under their own brand name. For the Dreadnought's first decade, the guitar was only available to a select number of retailers in large cities and yielded modest sales. As the 20s got underway, seismic changes were happening in music. It started shaking off its quaint 19th century ways and becoming more commercial.
The period of the 1920s and 30s in America was really a malleable flux. It was incredible what was going on musically. And one of the things that's happening is that country or folk music, ethnic music, or other kinds of regional musics are finding their way to the American public thanks to, technology, the phonograph record, the radio station. Musicians who would never have had a thought of a career in music were being heard. The Grand Ole Opry coming out of Nashville is putting people on the map who would never have been heard nationwide otherwise. And of course, we begin seeing guitars front and center. And of course, this was a time when microphones weren't really available. And the Dreadnought, because of its size and body, could be heard a little better than, the smaller parlor-type guitars that had preceded them.
In most bands, the guitar supplied background rhythm. But then something happened. Guitars began a slow, steady trip to the front of the stage, thanks to the Dreadnought's booming sound. This oversized guitar made more than music. It made a statement.
And country musicians found that that big, powerful, rumbling bass worked on stage in an auditorium, and it has a visual presence. It's rather imposing. You get up with a Dreadnought, people are like, okay, let's pay attention to that person.
By the beginning of the Depression, the Dreadnought was still finding its way. Annual sales amounted to a dozen or so guitars. 14 years after its introduction, the Dreadnought was still seen as a niche guitar prized for its booming bass. But that was about to change.
And unfortunately, the Great Depression was not kind to Ditson, and they went out of business. And of all the Ditson models that we had made up until that point in time, the Dreadnought was the only one we decided to keep making and put our name on it.
Martin, the originators of the Dreadnought, would now manufacture as well as distribute the guitar. In 1931, the first two models were introduced under Martin's name. They were the 12-fret D1 and the D2. Soon, they would be forever called the D18 and the D28.
And by this point, the 1931 D1 has an X-brace. It has a full, what we call belly bridge rather than the rectangular or the pyramid bridge. And it has a pickguard, which Martin first starts using. The standard Martin pickguard first starts happening in 1931.
Martin wasn't done tinkering with the Dreadnought. In 1934, a 14-fret neck was added to the D18 and D28, giving players the range they demanded. The modern design of the steel string flat-top Dreadnought was established.
In 1934, Martin switched to the 14-fret neck on most of his steel string guitars. Basically, what you'll see is if you imagine the upper bout of the guitar as kind of elastic or rubber, they just kind of pushed it down. The 12th fret to the 14th fret, the upper bout expands. So now it's a little bit broader at the upper bout and now square-shouldered instead of slope-shouldered. By 1934 and 1935, these are the earliest of what we consider the iconic Martin Dreadnought shape, the standard 14-fret neck D18.
For those first few years, Martin didn't show much enthusiasm for its newest model. The company didn't advertise it, and distribution was limited to a small group of dealers and musicians. Sales finally took off in 1935 when the Dreadnought made its first appearance in the Martin guitar catalog.
The reason that the demand started to increase afterwards with Martin was that just at the same time they started making the Dreadnoughts for Chicago Musical Instrument Company, the demand for large guitars for radio work was increasing. And from that point on, the Dreadnought took off and became the staple for Martin all through the 30s and 40s.
A prairie rain, I'm heading back respect to my guns and guitars.
In 1933, Gene Autry was a country and western music star, the original king of the singing cowboys. He would make dozens of movies and sell over 100 million records. With his first flush of success, he ordered a custom-made luxury Dreadnought from Martin, the first D45.
So here's Gene Autry, larger than life, on film, sitting on that incredible horse with that fantastic D45 Martin guitar, stunning people sitting in their seats, people aspiring to be musicians themselves maybe someday, and all they know is, I got to get me one of those stunning, beautiful, large guitars like Gene Autry's.
Gene Autry's star power gave the D45 and the rest of the Dreadnought line national visibility. The lavishly appointed pearl-laden D45 was a departure from the more austere design of the D18 and D28. Over the next 9 years, Martin would make 91 D45s until production stopped in 1942. By the end of World War II, the Dreadnought was sought after for recording and performing thanks to its great volume and deep resonance. What was once thought of as a guitar with an odd, oversized shape became a must-have instrument for many artists. With country music, the Dreadnought would move out of a band's rhythm section and take its rightful place at the front of the stage.
So Gene Autry is playing this fabulous guitar. People are seeing him all over the country. He's larger than life on the screen, and naturally he becomes a link in a chain that leads us to who some of the great artists are going to be in commercial country music in the next decade.
Hank Williams is widely considered the father of modern country music. His songs contain powerful, poetic lyrics that still inspire artists more than 60 years after his death at age 29. Hank Williams wrote and performed many of his numerous hits on a D28, establishing the Dreadnought as the go-to guitar for country artists.
The first Dreadnought that I ever saw was in Dallas, and it was Hank Williams. And then I used to watch the Big D Jamboree. You'd see a lot of Dreadnoughts, and sort of started with country music in Texas for me.
Look at people like Hank Williams or Gene Autry, and you saw them playing these big-bodied guitars, and so all of your heroes played one.
About a year after the untimely death of Hank Williams, a young singer with a booming baritone voice and a Dreadnought to match walked into Sun Studios in Memphis, Tennessee. He was there to audition for the owner, Sam Phillips. His name was Johnny Cash, and he got the recording contract.
My dad always said that he felt safe with a Dreadnought. And the look of him holding a Dreadnought from my early childhood, I couldn't separate the two. That was my dad, that was a Dreadnought. They both spoke to me of love and the largest protective figure in my life, and who he was and what he did and how he related to an audience. Everything was bound up in that image.
While more and more country artists were using the Dreadnought, it also played a role in creating a new genre of American music in the mid-40s.
And of course, out of this and out of the early hillbilly bands, as they were called, Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers and that sort of thing, bluegrass began to coalesce and congeal. And in bluegrass, it's kind of interesting that we can point to one particular figure who was prominent in bringing that genre, into focus, and that would be the great Bill Monroe.
By the time that bluegrass music was introduced, the first bluegrass performance was August of 1945 in the Ryman Auditorium by Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. From that time onward, Dreadnought sales really took off because bluegrass music utilized the guitar in a way quite different from previous. So they really, really wanted that punch.
Bill Monroe, singer, songwriter, mandolin player, granddaddy of bluegrass, and one of the Dreadnought's biggest fans.
He really fine-tuned the bluegrass ensemble. Of course, Bill Monroe was up front on the mandolin with his high, lonesome vocal sound, but he wanted a strong rhythmic component to his bluegrass. He was blues-influenced and gospel-influenced and country ballad-influenced. And the guitar became a real centerpiece in the bluegrass sound. And of course, the Martin guitar, the Dreadnought style guitar, could be heard over that ensemble. It could lay down that rhythm track like no other type of guitar. So much so that Bill Monroe bought a Martin guitar for his bluegrass ensemble. In an ever-changing number of personnel, there would always be a Martin guitar that the guitar player would play. That's how important it was to him.
In 1963, Monroe hired a talented young banjo picker named Del McCoy to join his Bluegrass Boys as an alternate lead singer and harmony voice. Soon enough, Del was playing Monroe's own 1939 D28.
Never seriously played guitar until I went to work for Bill, you know, and of course that was the only guitar we had. That was a great guitar. It was a 1939 D28 and the herringbone, and it had a certain sound, you know, and he liked that guitar to be on his records, especially, you know. And of course, I didn't own a guitar myself then, so yeah, I really was a great partner with that guitar. I loved that thing, you know. I had no choice, you know, but to play it, you know, and if I'd had my own guitar, I would have probably played his anyway. You know, it had a tone all of its own, and you know, a lot of the Martins do. They have a little bit of a distinct tone all by themselves. And his did that. And if I heard that thing today, I believe I'd recognize it. I wouldn't have to see it. I could tell by that sound, you know.
The Dreadnought makes it possible for the acoustic guitar to be more than just background. It can play a role up front and center. And as bluegrass guitar players became skilled at picking out hot leads, hot licks on the acoustic guitar, the Martin Dreadnought was perfect. It could be heard. It was loud. The tone was clear. The clarity was there. Not just that, but the action and the precision so that a guitar player could move quickly up and down the neck was crucial.
Three guitarists rooted in folk, country, and bluegrass helped influence generations of musicians. Doc Watson, blind since before his first birthday, bought a Martin D18 on an installment plan in 1940. His intricate flat and finger-picked technique was a revelation and a beacon for future players.
One of the first people that I saw play a Martin was Doc Watson.
Doc's humility and his honesty and his simplicity and also intelligence is all kind of wrapped up in the same thing. So I guess the Dreadnought was, for me, supported by his use of it because it lended more dignity and value to that instrument.
Musical traditions are passed from one player to the next and from one generation to another. Doc Watson's playing inspired another guitar virtuoso, Clarence White.
He told me, he said, Clarence was there every night watching Doc. After that, he said, Clarence just blossomed, just like that. He saw all those things that could be done with a guitar, you know.
Clarence White, with his band the Kentucky Colonels, played speedy, flat-picked licks on his D28 and forever changed the sound of bluegrass. In 1968, he would help create country rock while playing with the Byrds.
A dear friend of mine, Roland White, whose brother was Clarence White, one of the greatest guitar players that ever lived, one of my greatest influences. And Clarence is one of the first people I ever heard really flat picking a Dreadnought guitar.
Clarence White was probably the best flat picker I ever played with, and he was like Doc Watson. I mean, he could do fiddle tunes on the guitar, and it was incredible. We used to do it in the Byrds show, Black Mountain Rag and Soldier's Joy, and it would bring the house down every time.
So Clarence White dies tragically and his guitar stops, but his guitar playing continues. The link, the mantle is passed to one of the greats in bluegrass, Tony Rice.
And Tony Rice ended up with his guitar. It's a special Dreadnought. It's got a bigger hole. I'm not sure the story goes. I think he got burned with a cigarette or something like that, or he had to cut it bigger, and it made a different sound.
He becomes a member of the David Grisman Quintet, and David Grisman brings a whole new way of hot licks playing to the table, new ways of putting chords together, revolutionizes, I don't know if we can even call it bluegrass anymore. And there's Tony Rice taking the Martin acoustic guitar to new heights, places it has never been before, with lightning licks that would be difficult even for the human mind to comprehend.
Folk music was confined to Appalachia and other parts of rural America through the first half of the 20th century. It began a slow rise to national prominence in the late 50s. The epicenter of the folk revival was New York City's Greenwich Village.
So the middle 1950s is incredible. The Kingston Trio kicks off a whole groundswell of interest in folk music. We have a young college student who was from Minnesota who comes to New York City as Bob Dylan and begins not just reinterpreting songs, but writing new songs that sound like they could have been written 100 years ago. And that attracts other people to New York City. Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez, Phil Oakes, who begins writing songs of his own, all come to New York. They're all playing the best possible guitar that they can. The Martin guitar becomes the go-to guitar in the world of this new rise of folk music in America.
When the Kingston Trio introduced their first albums in the latter part of the 1950s, college students around the United States went and bought Martin guitars to form tribute bands to the Kingston Trio. Martin guitar sales took off. We often joke that this building is a result of Kingston Trio demand. And this is really the tipping point for Martin's growth and the extreme popularity of the Dreadnought.
I think the Dreadnought was really important in the Village in the 60s. Fred Neil had one. A lot of the folk singers had them. It was the guitar to have if you were a folk singer, to have a Dreadnought.
In the early 50s, the Dreadnought was the guitar of choice for many country, bluegrass, and folk musicians. In 1954, the guitar played a crucial role in making the record that helped kick off the rock revolution.
Here we have a period, in the early 50s when a young Elvis Presley is growing up in Mississippi. He's hearing records by Jimmy Rogers, Hank Williams. He wants to be like them. His family moves to Memphis, Tennessee, and Elvis has designs on a recording career. He shows up in the Sun Studios right there in Memphis. They begin recording with Sam Phillips, the owner of the studio, and what Elvis is delivering is basically country music a la Hank Williams and such. And while that's all right, Sam Phillips was looking for something that jumped a little more. They take a break. Elvis famously starts wanging on that Martin D18 of his and singing an old blues song that was recorded in 1939, a thing called That's All Right Mama. Sam Phillips says that's what we're looking for, and they record the song, they release it, and it launches Elvis Presley, and forevermore he plays that D18 guitar on stage in the early stages of his career as one of the great rock and roll artists of all time.
In 1965, with British invasion bands topping the American charts, rock was in full bloom. The genre's popularity soared after one revolutionary artist married folk and rock and made music history.
Somehow it all comes together, and Bob Dylan is really the impetus for that. Suddenly rock and rollers want to sound like Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan wants to sound more like rock and rollers. And a new genre, folk rock, comes into being with remarkable entertainers.
I remember George told me once that the Beatles and Bob Dylan had kind of an argument. And I said, what was it about? And he said, well, Bob came up to us and said, you guys, you're making really great music, but you're not saying anything. And right after that, the Beatles started doing some more meaningful material.
In the 1960s and early 1970s, the most creative time in American music occurred with the Woodstock generation. Crosby, Stills, Nash, Neil Young, Judy Collins, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Don McLean, on and on and on. Everybody playing a Martin Dreadnought.
Late 60s rock was dominated by the electric guitar, but the creation of one talented supergroup in 1968 would be built around a D45.
I think Buffalo Springfield got hired by the Byrds to play a bunch of opening shows. And David Crosby saw us, and the first thing he did was try and get us fired, because we were too good. Well, if you ask him, he will tell you that.
Stills in particular is a fantastic acoustic player. Much better than me.
We ended up seeing the Hollies the same night. And then Cass Elliot came over to me later that night or the next night and said, when David Crosby tells you to come over to my house with your guitar, be sure and do it. I have a surprise for you. And so he called and said, Stephen, do you have your guitar? And that's the silliest question you ever heard, because I was never without my guitar. I ran over to Cass's house. We walked into this dining room after chatting and meeting this startling-looking Englishman, that I'd just seen. It was like that voice, right? And we sang, and he joined in the third time, and lives changed.
When the promoters of the Woodstock Music Festival invited Crosby, Stills, and Nash to perform, it was only their second show together. In front of 400,000 people, they played their dreadnoughts and floored the festival. It was a reminder to the world that the acoustic guitar still had a place in rock.
That's what everybody saw us first with, was Stills playing a dreadnought and us singing Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. So I think, we helped. I hope we helped Martin. I know Martin helped us.
When people ask us about what really happened at Woodstock, they have no idea what we went through. As you said, it was only our second gig ever in front of people, right? And this wasn't just in front of people. This was in front of, what, hundreds of thousands of people? And so it was interesting doing something like Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, which we do with one guitar, and Guinevere, for instance, because he played Guinevere on his D45, and to play to hundreds of thousands of people with just one acoustic guitar and two voices, and hope that and hope that your sound and the delivery and emotion of the song make it through hundreds of thousands of people was very interesting. At Woodstock, the Martins were killer.
In 1968, popular demand brought back the iconic D45, which had been out of production since World War II. In 1974 and 75, Martin sold an astonishing 30,000 Dreadnought models. The guitar that debuted in 1916 and sold to a small group of players had come a long way. Popular music was undergoing big changes in the early 80s. Keyboards and synthesizers were replacing acoustic guitars. For the first time in decades, the Dreadnought was in decline.
By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the demand for acoustic guitar dropped dramatically, thanks to digital sampling keyboards and disco music.
In the 80s in country music, there was, well, for me anyway, and for a lot of other people, more of a fusion and a hybrid quality, of pop, bringing pop music in it. And I think everybody was influenced by Kim Carnes' Betty Davis Eyes, with that really prominent keyboard sound. There were a lot more keyboards. And the Dreadnought and acoustic guitars in general were a little more unfashionable. And later on in that decade, it seems like, if I have my timing right, that a lot of people started to embrace it again. Roots music, the acoustic guitar sound. Some people never turned away. And it was kind of good to have that cultural or radio or, perception of a break from it, because when it came back with a vengeance and this beauty and power that people loved it so much again, myself included.
It was always interesting for me. I always have an acoustic section in my show. Very rarely do I do a show that doesn't have some acoustic in it. A lot of times in the 70s, I'd start my show with a couple of 2 or 3 acoustic numbers, or in the middle, I'd do a break and do some acoustic numbers, or I'd come out and do an encore with my acoustic guitar, which is always a really cool thing, because it's different.
Within 10 years, the acoustic guitar was rescued from an unlikely source.
In the early 1990s, MTV Unplugged came on the scene with acoustic performances by Eric Clapton, Paul McCartney, Bob Dylan, Neil Young, Kurt Cobain, everybody playing Martin guitars. And this had a tremendous impact on Martin and on the resurgence of acoustic music in America.
They took people that had moved away from the acoustic guitar and or were never really known as acoustic guitar players and said, would you come into the studio? We'll fix you up with some fine guitars, Martin guitars, and would you play some of your favorite songs? And boy, oh boy, people really responded to that. And the next thing you know, our phone started to ring and we were ready.
The thing I loved about it is you could tell who could really play, when you took their amps away and gave them something like this. Neil sounded great. Kiss didn't sound so great, that you could really separate the wheat from the chaff in those situations. So I like that a lot. But yeah, you see Kurt Cobain really recreating those Nirvana songs and David Bowie songs and Meat Puppets songs in a way that was extremely creative. I'd never seen anybody play the acoustic guitar like that before. And now somebody like Jay Mascis does that sometimes too, but a lot of volume and a lot of noise and a lot of unnatural acoustic guitar sounds. But when I saw that as a teenager, it blew my mind, And I was even trying to figure out the pickup that Kurt had on his guitar, and why did he have knobs on the top, and what was going on with all that stuff. It just looked like somebody had cobbled it together from junk auto parts or something.
The Dreadnought came back stronger than ever as a new generation of artists discovered the roots of America's music and began creating exciting new genres.
Probably 90%, 95% of what I've written, if it's in the guitar realm, I wrote with the Martin Dreadnought.
I used to play a lot of electric guitar and Telecasters, and then just sort of fell out of love with it. And now the Dreadnought's sort of the only thing that feels right, I've written and recorded every single song I've ever, put to tape on a Dreadnought. If you can't play a song on acoustic guitar, it's probably not a very good song.
Throughout the 20th century, the piano was the most popular instrument in America. But as we came into the new millennium, the Dreadnought guitar surpassed the piano and remains the most popular musical instrument in the world, as well as the most popular body size and shape.
In 100 years, the Dreadnought made its way from a guitar designed for Hawaiian musicians to worldwide popularity. It has stood the test of time and survived endlessly changing musical tastes. The Dreadnought's sound is woven through generations of American music. What started out as a simple, oversized guitar ended up becoming a genuine musical icon.
Neil had loaned Dylan a tour bus or had leased it out to him for some tour at some point. And when he got it back, there was a Martin Dreadnought in the back of the tour bus, in the back lounge. And Neil thought, well, that's a sweet present, and he played it for a little while, and then the next time he talked to Bob explained to him that it had belonged to Hank Williams. So the same Martin Dreadnought belonged to Hank Williams, Bob Dylan, and Neil Young. And yeah, that's not going to happen with a lot of guitars.
Man, everything you hear from the Beatles to Led Zeppelin to the Stanley Brothers, there's Dreadnoughts on those records, and even then beyond, It's just that it's a very unmistakable sound.
I don't want to get too ethereal about it. It's still a piece of wood and wire. But how they put it together, it has a certain voice, and it has a really good voice. It's a big voice. It's very even-toned. It's got an astounding quality to it. They mature when they're about 8 years old. They're very good right off the rack when you first get them, but after you have them for a while, they sound like that. And I don't think anything touches them really.
I don't want to bring in a bunch of other brands, but if you think about the Converse All-Star or like, you know, the Chevy Impala in that movie Drive, you know, like it gets the job done, you know. I mean, you can hot rod it up a little bit if you need to, but for the most part, it's an instrument that serves the music and doesn't get in the way of it.
It seems to me the Dreadnought, if you showed a picture to anyone in the world, they would recognize it as quintessentially American, that it would represent purity, you know, a purity of sound, a purity of tradition, roots music, and sincerity and truthfulness.
My ancestors, if they could come back and look at the quality of the product we're making today, they would say that's exactly what we would have hoped, that you carried on this grand tradition of trying to make the best guitars on earth.
Awful early to be singing this old guitar and me, and the things that we've been through. C.F. Martin built it back in 1942. I remember when we met, I was only 17. I spent all my college money on a half a dozen strings. I thought my folks would kill me, but I found out I was wrong. They said your future's written on your face, you sing those traveling songs. So we headed for Kentucky, with a suitcase full of dreams, rough out boots, a few t-shirts, a worn out pair of jeans. I remembered most of it. That's pretty good.